Magine stumbling upon an old photograph, one that shouldn't exist. Two boys, barefoot and eerily identical, standing outside a dilapidated cabin. Their faces are the same, yet something about them is wrong. Like a copy of a copy, a glitch in reality. A photograph that would haunt anyone who saw it, yet no one knows who took it, or why it was hidden. This is no ghost story. This is the beginning of a strange and disturbing tale, one filled with twisted lineage, isolation, and a haunting mystery buried deep within the Appalachian hills. Before we dive into this unsettling tale, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and share it with friends. You don't want them to miss what comes next. In the spring of 1939, after devastating floods in southeastern Kentucky, a group of local archivists began salvaging documents. Among the wreckage of old church records and property ledgers, something strange was found. A photograph, curled at the edges, sat hidden between papers. Two boys stood outside a weathered cabin, their faces nearly identical, yet something about them was wrong. Their eyes, their mouths. They seemed like a reflection that didn't quite match. No studio mark, no photographer's name, no negatives to trace. The boys were captured in time, but their origins were impossible to place. Who were they, and why were they so eerily similar? It was filed under a generic label, Unknown Children, Possible Homestead Case. The archivist who cataloged it, Thomas Sullivan, couldn't recall doing so. He felt the photo had been purposely hidden, waiting to be found, or perhaps never seen at all. The boys in the photo weren't twins, but their similarities were too perfect. One's jawline was slightly misaligned. The other's eyes never quite focused. It was like someone had copied one child, but got it wrong. Locals began to whisper. They called them the mirror children. Two boys, always seen together, always moving in sync. But no one could explain where they came from. No birth records, no baptism, no trace of their family. The homestead they appeared to be from had long since vanished. The cabin was buried under time, and Hollow Ridge, where it once stood, wasn't even marked on most maps. But the story of these boys remained. In interviews years later, elderly residents who had lived near the area said they recognized the cabin. The roof sloped just so. The warped porch beam. Even the missing third step seemed familiar to them. The name of the place, however, was lost. The boys were seen near this cabin for years. They never grew older. They were pale, thin, and always together. No one ever heard their voices. They never seemed to speak to anyone. They were silent as shadows, constantly in motion, but never leaving the confines of their strange, isolated home. One local mailman, Edward Tullis, described the boys in 1969. They weren't twins, not exactly. They were like mirrors of each other, but one was always a little off. One eye lower, a mouth slightly crooked. Tullis had seen them many times. They would stand quietly at the tree line, watching him as he made his deliveries. He could never bring himself to speak to them. Something about their stillness was unsettling. They never blinked, never looked away. The only person seen near them was an older man named Lyle Merriweather, known in the area as a recluse who lived in the cabin. He had been absent from town life since the early 1920s, but rumors about him persisted. They said he was their father, but no one could say for sure. No birth certificates were ever filed for the boys, no school records, no baptisms. Their existence seemed to defy all logic, as though they had slipped through the cracks of time and bureaucracy, untouched by the world. Lyle Merriweather's cabin had once been a modest one-room structure built in 1906. He had inherited it after his father's death, and although it lacked any real improvements, it was always kept in perfect order. Then, in 1921, everything stopped. Lyle disappeared from public records entirely. The only trace of him came from an obscure church ledger from 1923, which mentioned Lyle being removed from the congregation on grounds of moral unfitness. It was the last time his name appeared in any official document. From then on, his life was erased. From that year onward, no one saw him. No one knew what happened to him. But the stories began to grow. Rumors spread that the boys were not only his children, but that they had been born in some strange, unnatural way. It was a mystery that no one could explain, but everyone feared to question. Then, in 1938, the boys were seen again. A traveling merchant, Howard Kittner, reported seeing them near the cabin. He described them as unnaturally still, almost like they were waiting for something. They did not acknowledge him when he passed. It was as though they were trapped in time. Howard Kittner wasn't the only one who saw them. Several other men, local hunters and loggers, spoke of seeing the boys in the woods, always in pairs, always silent. There was no sign of a mother or any other guardian. The boys were always alone. Something about the whole situation disturbed Kittner. It wasn't just their eerie stillness, but the way they appeared to be mirroring each other's movements, almost as though they were one entity. Something about them wasn't natural. He wrote a letter to the state welfare office, hoping someone would investigate. The letter was never answered. The boys and Lyle Merriweather remained untouched by the authorities. As the years passed, the story of the Mirror Children grew into local folklore, a legend told in whispers, passed down by the men who still remembered what they had seen. Kittner's letter would be the last known attempt to reach out for help. The boys and their cabin remained a mystery, slipping further and further into the past as the world around them continued to forget. But the land never forgot. The woods around Hollow Ridge seemed to hold their secrets. Even the ground felt strange, as though something was watching. It was a place that the locals avoided, a place where time seemed to slow down, and the normal rules of the world no longer applied. The road to Hollow Ridge was not a simple one. It twisted through the dense Appalachian forests, barely wide enough for a mule-drawn cart. Few had ventured there, and fewer still returned unchanged. The Merriweather cabin stood alone in the heart of the ridge, a forgotten relic of a time that had slipped through the cracks of history. Its wood had aged, the roof sagging, but it remained standing as if anchored by something far beyond mere timber. Lyle Merriweather, who had once been a known figure in town, was never seen in public again after 1921. His sudden disappearance sparked whispers that never stopped, feeding a rumor mill that twisted every word into something darker. Over the years, the cabin became a place of quiet dread. Those who lived nearby spoke in hushed tones of the strange events that occurred there. Strange lights at night, unexplained sounds, and the presence of the two boys. Hunters who ventured close to the cabin often described the boys as uncomfortably still, like statues made of flesh. They never spoke, never moved, and yet they were always there watching, waiting, as if expecting something. One such man, Edgar Mullins, a local hunter, spoke of his experience in 1956. He claimed that while tracking deer near the creek, he saw the boys standing by the water, motionless, their eyes never blinking, their heads tilted in eerie synchronicity. Mullins tried to approach, but when he stepped into the creek, neither of the boys reacted. They were like reflections of each other, perfect in their mimicry, yet unsettling in their stillness. Something about them was wrong. He had no idea who they were, but their appearance felt deliberate, like two halves of something that should never have been. As he watched, the boys slowly faded into the background, blending with the trees like ghosts. The stories of the Mirror Children were never formally investigated. Local lawmen avoided the area, and no one seemed interested in uncovering the truth. It was as if the land itself resisted scrutiny, pushing outsiders away with an unseen force. There were no birth certificates, no names in any official documents. The boys simply appeared, always together, always the same. And those who dared venture near the cabin spoke of an oppressive silence that weighed heavily on their minds. One thing was clear: The boys were tied to the land, to that cabin. They were part of the ridge, and it seemed as though the earth itself had claimed them, like it had claimed their father before them. The strange stillness that surrounded them was not just physical. It seemed to seep into the minds of those who encountered the boys, making them question reality. Were they seeing what they thought they were seeing, or was something darker at play? The land around Hollow Ridge was thick with fog, and the air was heavy with the smell of damp earth. It was a place that seemed to have forgotten the passage of time. The past clung to it like ivy, unyielding and persistent, but no one dared to probe too deeply. The locals had learned long ago to avoid the ridge, to turn away when the cabin came into view. Something about it felt like a wound in the land, a place that should have been left alone. It wasn't just superstition that kept people away. There were those who had entered the ridge looking for answers, but none had returned with a clear story. The boys were always there, watching, but they never offered any explanation. In the late 1940s, the boys were seen again, this time by a traveling merchant named Howard Kittner. He described them as identical but strange, their eyes cloudy, their movements unnervingly synchronized. They never reacted to him or his presence. Kittner was disturbed by the encounter, but he didn't know how to explain it. He wrote to the state welfare office, hoping for some investigation into the situation, but his letter was never answered. The boys and their existence were simply ignored. As the years passed, the boys remained a part of local folklore. Stories of their strange appearance, their silent movements, and their eerie connection to the land of Hollow Ridge spread among the men of the region. But the more the stories spread, the less anyone seemed willing to seek the truth. The land resisted. It had a way of hiding things, burying them deep in the earth, like forgotten secrets that were better left undisturbed. And so the legend of the Mirror Children grew. The boys remained, always in pairs, always in silence. Their presence on Hollow Ridge became a symbol of something darker, a mystery that no one could solve and no one dared to unravel. In June of 1949, Howard Kittner, a traveling merchant, was making his usual rounds in the rugged hills of Kentucky. His route took him near the now infamous Hollow Ridge, where the Mirror Children were often seen. Kittner had heard the stories of the strange boys, but like most, he dismissed them as local folklore. That was until he saw them with his own eyes, standing motionless on the porch of a decaying cabin. They didn't move as he approached, standing side by side, their bare feet dusty from the earth. Their faces were nearly identical, yet something about them made Kittner pause, a feeling of unease creeping up his spine. One of the boys appeared to be staring past him, while the other's eyes were unfocused, lost in some distant thought. It was as if they weren't quite present in the world around them, and Kittner could feel it. Despite their unsettling stillness, Kittner was compelled to speak. He greeted them politely, tipping his hat as he passed. The boys did not respond. They didn't even blink, only continued to stand as though they had not heard him at all. Kittner continued his route, but something gnawed at him. There was no normality in their silence, no flicker of humanity in the way they held themselves. He felt as though he had seen something that shouldn't have been there. He tried to push the encounter out of his mind, but it lingered. The boys, their identical faces, their strange, empty gaze, it didn't sit right with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was hidden in that cabin. After some time, Kittner made a decision. He would report what he saw to the state authorities. He wrote a letter to the Kentucky State Welfare Office in Frankfort describing his encounter with the boys on the porch. The letter was brief, but unsettling. Kittner detailed how the boys appeared underfed, but not starved. They were barefoot and silent, as if existing in a world separate from his own. They were unnaturally still, their eyes never blinking, never reacting. He also mentioned the eerie nature of the cabin, its dilapidated state, and the oppressive atmosphere surrounding the area. Kittner didn't know if it warranted attention, but he felt that something had to be done. The letter was sent in the summer of 1949, but it would never reach anyone who cared. Kittner's report was filed under a routine log and left unaddressed. The boys, and the mystery of Hollow Ridge, faded further into obscurity. Over the years, Kittner would occasionally hear rumors about the boys, but no one ever seemed to have answers. Some dismissed the stories as wild imaginings, while others claimed the boys were nothing but ghosts from the past. But the more Kittner thought about it, the more he became convinced that the boys were real and that something much darker lay beneath the surface of Hollow Ridge. He couldn't forget the stillness in their eyes. As time went on, the local authorities seemed to have no interest in investigating the boys. The legend of the Mirror Children became just that, legend. The truth of what happened at Hollow Ridge was buried, left to fester in the shadows of forgotten history. Kittner himself would later leave the area, his curiosity about the boys and the mystery of Hollow Ridge never fully satisfied. He continued his work as a traveling merchant, but the boys and the cabin were never far from his mind. For years, the stories of the boys remained isolated in the hills of Kentucky. No official inquiry was made, and the world outside remained oblivious to the unsettling truth of Hollow Ridge. The Mirror Children were forgotten, as were their guardians, their history. But the land remembered. Hollow Ridge had always been a place steeped in mystery. The trees, the soil, the cabin, they had witnessed it all. And though the boys may have vanished from public record, their presence lingered like an unspoken truth. The government never intervened, the authorities never investigated, and the boys, two silent figures trapped in a world of their own, remained the final chapter of a story no one would dare to complete. The cabin on Hollow Ridge had always been more than just a place of residence. It was a structure rooted in mystery, its walls holding secrets that no one dared uncover. Those who ventured too close often spoke of its unnatural silence. By the 1940s, the cabin was barely standing. Its roof sagged, and the wood had rotted over the years. Yet the eerie atmosphere that hung around it remained intact, as if the land itself had claimed it. Lyle Merriweather, once a well-known figure in the area, was thought to have withdrawn from society after 1921. But the strange presence of the boys, seen near the cabin for over 2 decades, suggested something far darker at play. No one knew for sure if the boys were Lyle's children, but their eerie presence and unwavering silence suggested they were more than mere residents of the cabin. It was as if they had been waiting for something. Rumors spread that Lyle had raised the boys in isolation, keeping them far from the outside world. The cabin had become a sanctuary for them, a place where they were not subject to the laws or norms of society. The boys lived by strange rules. No one knew how they survived or if they ever slept. Their lives seemed to revolve around rituals, silent actions performed in perfect sync, like two halves of a single soul. The cabin itself reflected the boys' way of life. It was a place of silence and stillness, where every object had its place. There were no mirrors, no reflective surfaces of any kind. Even the windows were covered to prevent reflection. Inside, the boys followed a routine that seemed almost ritualistic. Meals were eaten in silence, their movements synchronized, as if they were performing a dance. They copied each other's actions down to the smallest detail. One of the most unsettling aspects of the cabin was the lack of personal belongings. There were no photos of relatives, no mementos, only objects arranged with eerie precision. Everything had a purpose, and nothing was left to chance. The boys never spoke of their past. No one ever heard them utter a word. Their lives were a constant repetition of the same actions, as if they were trapped in an endless cycle. The outside world never entered their reality. As the years passed, the stories surrounding the cabin and the boys grew more ominous. The local men who ventured near the ridge spoke of an unseen force that seemed to repel them, urging them to turn back before they ventured too far. The area around the cabin was thick with fog, and the air was always heavy. It was as though the land itself had absorbed the boys' presence, becoming a reflection of their isolation and silence. Time itself seemed to slow. In the early 1950s, an investigator named Walter Briggs became interested in the strange happenings at Hollow Ridge. He was a man driven by curiosity, determined to uncover the truth of the boys and their connection to the land. Briggs made the journey to the cabin, hoping to gather answers. But when he arrived, he found the area strangely quiet, as though it had been frozen in time. The air was thick, and the trees seemed to watch him. Inside the cabin, Briggs discovered strange markings carved into the wooden beams. They resembled symbols of some ancient ritual, as if the boys had been part of something far more sinister than simple isolation. The markings were crude, but there was an undeniable precision to them. They were not random scratches, but deliberate ritualistic symbols. Briggs was disturbed by what he found, but he couldn't quite grasp their meaning. It became clear that the boys were not merely living in isolation. They were part of something larger, something far older, and their silence was not born of neglect or isolation, but of some unknown force that held them captive. Briggs left the cabin that day, his mind filled with more questions than answers. He tried to return the next day, but when he reached the ridge, the cabin was gone. It had vanished, as if it had never existed at all. For years, no one spoke of the cabin, and the boys became nothing more than a whispered memory. The land around Hollow Ridge slowly reclaimed the area, and the story of the Mirror Children was buried beneath layers of time and forgetfulness. But those who had seen the boys, who had witnessed their strange behavior, never forgot. They knew that something had happened at Hollow Ridge, something that had been hidden from the world, and they would never stop wondering what it had been. In the early spring of 1953, a man named Iveling Cross was assigned to a new program in Kentucky. His mission was to visit isolated families across the Appalachian region, reaching those who lived in forgotten hollows. Cross was a determined, idealistic man. He was newly graduated and eager to help the forgotten men living in the hills. His assignment took him to the town of Hyen, a place few had heard of. The land around Hyen was wild and untamed, the roads barely more than narrow trails carved into the earth. It was a place where the outside world had little influence, where people lived by their own rules. He was hired to check on men living in extreme isolation to ensure they had access to food, shelter, and other basic needs. Yet the people he was sent to help weren't easy to find, or to help. One of the first areas he was told to visit was Hollow Ridge. Few had ventured there, but rumors of strange happenings surrounded the place. It was a remote, untouched part of the mountains, known only to a few locals. He hired a local guide, a man named Lewis, to help him navigate the trails. But as they made their way through the dense woods, Lewis grew uneasy. The closer they got to Hollow Ridge, the more the land seemed to resist them. "No one goes there," Lewis warned Cross. "The woods don't like strangers. Best turn back." But Cross was determined. He pressed on, certain that whatever secrets Hollow Ridge held, they needed to be uncovered. The cabin on Hollow Ridge was hidden deep in the trees, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. When they reached it, the air seemed thick with something heavy and oppressive, as though the land had absorbed all the strange energy of the past. Inside the cabin, Cross found the two boys, just as the locals had described. They stood by the window, watching them, their faces identical, their movements eerily synchronized. They didn't speak, didn't acknowledge Cross and his guide in any way. The silence in the cabin was deafening. There was no sound, not even the wind outside. It was as if time had stopped in that place, and Cross felt as though he were intruding on something ancient and forgotten. Cross tried to engage with the boys, but they didn't respond. He asked questions, but their eyes never left him, never blinked. They stood perfectly still, like mirrors, but their stillness was unnatural, a presence that felt wrong. He noticed the strange symbols carved into the wooden beams of the cabin, much like those Briggs had found years before. It was as if the boys were part of some ritual, a force older than the land itself, and Cross began to feel the weight of that knowledge. Something in the cabin seemed to draw him in, as if the very walls were alive, watching. But despite the oppressive atmosphere, Cross refused to leave without trying to understand what was happening. He needed answers. He stayed the night in the cabin, the air growing colder as the evening progressed. The boys remained silent, still as statues, never once moving or speaking. By morning, Cross was exhausted, but determined to continue his investigation. That night, he began to write in his journal. His entries became shorter, more frantic, as he described the boys' strange behavior. "They don't breathe like we do," he wrote. "Their eyes are empty. They are not like us." As he sat in the dim light, Cross began to realize that there was something deeply wrong with the cabin. It wasn't just the boys. It was the entire place, the very land beneath his feet. It felt as though it was holding its breath. He felt watched, not just by the boys, but by something else, something older, something tied to the very earth. His thoughts began to spiral, but just as he began to write more, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside. Cross stood up and went to the door, but when he opened it, there was nothing there. Just the cold, damp night. He closed the door quickly and locked it, but the feeling of being watched never left him. The next morning, Cross awoke to find the boys standing by the door, staring at him. Their eyes never blinked, never moved. They were identical in every way, but it was clear they were not like him, not like any other living being. With a growing sense of dread, Cross packed his belongings and prepared to leave. But just as he stepped outside, he realized something strange. The land around the cabin had shifted. The path he had used to enter was gone, replaced by dense foliage. No one ever saw Cross again. His guide, Lewis, returned to Cheyenne alone, claiming that Cross had gone missing in the woods. A search was conducted, but no sign of him was found. The cabin was gone, as though it had never existed. The authorities filed the case as a missing persons report, but it was soon forgotten. The investigation was closed, and the story of Evelyn Cross became another whisper in the long list of strange happenings in the hills. In the spring of 1954, the land surrounding Hollow Ridge was quiet. No one had dared to venture into the area for months, and the cabin was left to slowly rot, swallowed by the encroaching trees. Then one morning, a light haze was seen curling above the trees. It wasn't the thick black smoke of a raging fire, but a pale gray mist that rose from the ground, spreading out like steam from a kettle. Caleb Langford, a local farmer who owned land bordering the Merriweather property, was the first to notice. He rode his mule toward the ridge, drawn by the strange smell in the air. It wasn't the scent of burning wood. Langford described the smell as something metallic, like wet copper mixed with earth. It felt wrong, out of place in the usual damp mountain air. He stopped at the ridge and stared at the rising smoke in silence. He didn't cross into the area. Something in his gut told him to stay away. As he looked toward the Merriweather cabin, a feeling of unease crept over him, as if the very land was holding its breath. 2 days later, the fire was discovered by a group of local men who had been cutting timber nearby. They were the first to reach the site, finding the cabin reduced to ashes, its remains strangely compact and isolated. There were no signs of external flames. The fire seemed to have started from within, a slow, controlled burn that consumed the cabin from the inside out. The surrounding forest remained untouched, undisturbed by the flames. The men examined the remnants of the cabin, but they found no bodies. No trace of Lyle Merriweather, no sign of the boys, not even a hint of their presence. It was as if they had vanished into the earth itself. Among the charred remains, they found strange, unsettling items. Pieces of bone, a burnt leather shoe, and something that seemed to be a human jawbone. But none of these pieces matched any known person in the region. The sheriff was called to the scene, but he was as baffled as the men who discovered the fire. There was no explanation for the fire's origin, and no evidence that could connect it to any known person or family. The authorities conducted a brief investigation, but no leads were found. The remains were cataloged, but no further action was taken. The case was quietly closed, as many similar cases had been over the years. Local gossip began to spread, with many claiming the fire was a sign. Some said the land had claimed the cabin, that it was a warning to anyone who dared to uncover its secrets. Others whispered that the fire had been no accident, but no one dared to search the ridge further. The area remained untouched, left to the trees and the silence of the hills. The cabin's ashes were all that remained, a reminder of something that should have been forgotten. A few days after the fire, a letter was found in the sheriff's office. It had no return address, no signature. The only words on the page were, "The blood went in circles. The twins were never meant to see the sun." The letter was typed on an old Remington typewriter, the ink smudged from years of use. No one knew who had sent it or why. It seemed to be a warning, a cryptic message that no one fully understood. The sheriff filed the letter away, as he had done with so many other strange pieces of evidence. The fire at Hollow Ridge was just another chapter in a long list of unexplained events that had haunted the region for decades. The town moved on, but the memory of the fire lingered. Some men claimed to have seen the boys in the area months later, standing silently in the woods. Others said they had heard strange sounds late at night, like footsteps in the distance. But as the years passed, the story of the Mirror children faded from public memory. The cabin was forgotten, the fire became just another unsolved mystery, and the land slowly reclaimed the ridge, covering the signs of what had once been. In 1992, as the Kentucky Department of Transportation began planning a road expansion, workers started clearing the old pathways near Hollow Ridge. The dense woods were thick with trees, barely touched by human hands. One morning, while using a backhoe to remove tree roots and rocks, the machine struck something soft beneath the earth. At first, it was assumed to be animal remains, but as the dirt was moved, it became clear that it wasn't. The excavation team unearthed a shallow pit, about 6 feet in diameter. What they found in it caused the men to pause and step back, uneasy. Inside the pit were bones, child-sized but strangely malformed, almost identical in appearance. The bones were arranged in a way that suggested they had been placed deliberately, not scattered by animals. They were arranged in a position that resembled a resting place, as if the children had been laid to rest with purpose. The lead investigator, Dr. Eileen Cast, was called to the scene. She was a forensic anthropologist, known for her work on ancient and mysterious remains. She had seen many graves, but nothing like what she found at Hollow Ridge. As Dr. Cast examined the bones, she noted their unusual features. The skulls were deformed, not by trauma, but by premature fusion of the cranial plates. The teeth were misaligned, their symmetry too perfect to be accidental. The bones seemed almost too symmetrical, too alike, like they had been created with precision. But it was the markings on the smallest jawbone that stood out. Etched into the surface was a symbol, an infinity loop, barely noticeable. The symbol was strange, and it took Dr. Cast some time to recognize it. It resembled an ancient mark, one often associated with rituals and forgotten practices. She couldn't understand its full meaning, but it was clear that it wasn't random. Despite the eerie nature of the discovery, the case was filed as an indeterminate set of remains. There was no proof that they belonged to any known child or person. The remains were cataloged and stored, their mystery left unsolved. The bones were shipped to a state storage facility, where they remained for years, unnoticed and forgotten. No one in authority seemed to know what to do with them, and the records of the discovery grew more obscure with time. But in the years that followed, rumors began to circulate again. Local folklore started to mention the bones, and the story of the Mirror children resurfaced. People began to connect the dots. linking the strange remains to the legends of Hollow Ridge. The bones were a clear sign that something unnatural had occurred in that area. The children found in the pit were not ordinary children. They were tied to the land, to the cabin, to the mystery that had haunted the ridge for decades. In the late 1990s, Dr. Cast spoke publicly about her findings, suggesting that the bones were part of a twisted genetic experiment. She believed that the boys, the mirror children, were the product of generations of isolation, a deliberate attempt to create something beyond nature. The bones seemed to confirm the rumors, reinforcing the theory that the Merriweather family had not merely isolated themselves, but had actively sought to preserve a bloodline, perhaps through inbreeding, perhaps through something even darker. As the years passed, the bones became a part of the legend. Locals would speak of them in hushed tones, remembering the boys, remembering the strange cabin, and wondering if the land still held its secrets. Hollow Ridge remained as much a part of their lives as the mountains themselves. But despite the fascination with the bones, no further investigation was conducted. The remains were left untouched, filed away as an unsolved mystery. The state seemed content to let the story of the mirror children fade into history. Yet, in the quiet corners of the mountains, the memory of the boys lived on. Men who had grown up hearing the stories would tell them to their sons, and the cycle of fear and fascination continued, unbroken. In the early 2000s, the name Merriweather had faded from the collective memory of Kentucky's residents. Hollow Ridge had become a forgotten place, its secrets buried beneath overgrowth and the passage of time. But it wasn't gone. One day, a pair of hikers from Hazard County set out to map the area. Jeremy Fields and his companion, a volunteer scout named Derek, took a shortcut through the woods near the old Merriweather site, unaware of the history they were about to uncover. Fields had heard the stories of the mirror children as a child, but he thought they were just tall tales, the kind of myths born from isolation and fear. He never imagined he'd be walking into the past. The air was thick with mist as they approached the creek. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees. As they rounded a bend, Fields noticed something out of place, something that didn't belong. It was a wooden cross, crudely made from rough pine, tied together with rusted wire. At its base, two children's shoes were placed side by side. The shoes were old, from the 1950s, yet they appeared remarkably well preserved, pristine even. Fields and Derek paused. The shoes were a strange sight in the middle of the woods, and as they stepped closer, they saw that the cross had been scorched into the ground, the edges of the shoes singed by fire. "Someone's been here," Derek murmured, but Fields didn't respond. He was already kneeling beside the cross, staring at the shoes. There was something unnerving about them, something that made his skin crawl. The cross seemed out of place, its simplicity hiding the complexity of the question it posed. Why had it been left there? Who had placed the shoes there? And what did they mean? Fields couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on ground that shouldn't have been disturbed. They decided to take a photograph of the cross and the shoes, but as they moved around to get a better angle, something caught their eye further down the creek. Two figures standing in the distance, watching them. At first, Fields thought they were just other hikers, but as they drew closer, he realized they were two boys standing barefoot in the water. They were identical, their clothes neat but old-fashioned, their faces frozen in an eerie stillness. Fields called out to them, but they didn't respond. The boys remained motionless, their eyes locked onto the pair. Their presence felt wrong, like a ghost from the past, one that had refused to move on. Fields tried to approach them, but when he stepped into the creek, the boys didn't flinch. They didn't even move. They just stood there, staring, their gaze never leaving him. A chill ran down his spine, and his heart began to race. Derek was the first to turn away, stepping back toward the trail. Fields followed, but something in him urged him to turn around, to look one last time. When he did, the boys were gone. Just like that, they had vanished into the forest. The entire encounter left Fields shaken. He didn't know what to make of it. But he knew one thing. Whatever had been haunting Hollow Ridge was not a myth. The Mirror Children were real, and they were still out there. The following week, Fields showed the photograph of the cross and the shoes to a local historian named Mark Hensley. Hensley had spent his life collecting stories of the region, and when he saw the photo, his face grew pale. "That cross," Hensley said softly. "It's the same one from the stories. The boys are still out there, still waiting." He explained that the cross and the shoes had been seen by other locals over the years, but no one had ever been able to explain their meaning. Hensley had heard the legends of the Mirror Children for decades. According to local folklore, the boys had been born from the land itself, an ancient curse that had tied them to the forest. Some believed they were the embodiment of something darker, something that had never been meant to walk among men. The historian's words confirmed what Fields had feared. The boys were not merely a local myth. They were real, and they had a purpose, though what that purpose was remained a mystery that no one had been able to solve. Over the following months, Fields returned to Hollow Ridge several times, hoping to find answers. Each time he ventured deeper into the woods, closer to the place where the boys had appeared, but each time he found nothing. The ridge was silent, as it had always been. The story of the Mirror Children had become a legend, and as time passed, fewer people came to the region, content to leave its mysteries unexplored. But Fields knew better. He knew that the past had a way of resurfacing when it was least expected. In 2013, Royce Kellerman, a retired bondsman turned investigator, took an interest in the case. He had grown up hearing the tales of the Mirror Children, and when he stumbled upon old letters referencing the boys, his curiosity grew. Kellerman began investigating the history of the Merriweather family, tracing their lineage back through old documents and forgotten records. He found that the family had lived in isolation for generations, their names disappearing from public records, their existence hidden in the hills. The more he dug, the more he uncovered. There were reports of strange sightings, of two boys seen together in the woods, of people who had gone missing, their bodies never found. The evidence began to mount, and Kellerman realized he was on the verge of uncovering a truth that had been buried for decades. But just as he was about to present his findings, something strange happened. Kellerman received a letter, typed on an old Remington typewriter with no return address. It read simply, "You're getting too close." The letter was signed with the initials M. Merriweather. Kellerman's heart raced as he read the message, and he knew that the truth of the Mirror Children was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. But by then, it was too late.